Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. This is another special episode in which we consider the life and times of Alex Salmond, the late Alex Salmond. And once again, we extend our condolences to Mr. Salmond's friends and family on their loss. In part one of this two-part series, we tracked Salmond's early career, the career of the story of the SNP through the 1980s, 1990s, and into power in 2007. In this second episode, we'll be looking at Alex Salmond's second administration, dominated as it was, of course, by the great drama of the Scottish Independence Referendum of 2014, and then looking at the post-referendum period, his fallout with Nicola Sturgeon, his departure from the SNP, setting up a new pro-independence party, the Alba Party, and then we will finally consider what his place in history is, what his legacy is. So, Bernard, if we go back to 2011, this is an election in which the SNP win a majority in the Scottish Parliament. Very unexpected. It doesn't quite break the electoral system because the electoral system had been set up to prevent any party winning a majority on a minority of the vote, and hence a sort of disproportionate share of seats. What actually happens is that the SNP win a narrow majority, having won basically a majority of the votes. And many people who voted SNP in that election had not previously voted SNP, but they'd liked the swagger and the way in which Alex Salmond's first ministry had conducted its business. And they were happy, therefore, to vote SNP as an endorsement of Salmond's record in government. Many of those people then were, of course, somewhat surprised to discover that they had created the conditions in which a referendum on Scottish independence was now more likely than not. Take us back to that period, to 2011. Suddenly, the SNP have this overwhelming election result and a mandate to pursue, for the first time, really, a credible path towards independence. Set the scene for us and remind us of what was happening then and how it felt both to the nationalists and to their political opponents.
Well, perhaps the first thing to say is that we should look at Alex Salmond's political journey and where 2011 fits into that journey. In the first edition of the podcast, we made the point that he effectively grafted onto the SNP a political identity, that of social democracy. And what that was designed to do was to take votes from the Labour Party in order to get the SNP into power. And in 2007, that strategy bears fruit. The second part of his trajectory to power that he was keen to bed in was the notion that the SNP could be a competent administration, and through being a competent administration could use that as a springboard in which to have a constitutional referendum. He also wanted to get to a situation where the SNP were regarded as the natural party of government. And one of the reasons why 2011 is so important in historical terms, it's not just that, in a sense, the electoral system is bust, they get 65 seats and all this kind of stuff. That's always the line that commentators actually mention. I think if you actually start to drill down into the results in 2011, it's very, very profound because it tells you that this is a party with a complete stranglehold over the country. And it was more profound than the stranglehold that Labour at its height had over Scotland, because in 2011 what we saw was a party which was all-conquering. It was a party of the north, the south, the west, the east. It was a party of the urban, it was a party of the rural, and it was a party of all social classes. 2011, therefore, is a significant milestone, and if you like, you could probably say it's high Salmond in terms of where he wanted to take the party electorally. The second consequence of that is that no government at Westminster could credibly have said, we are not going to entertain the idea of an independence referendum, given that the result that we had in 2011. But the practical effect on the politics of the country, and this is true whenever you get a constitutional referendum, in a sense, all of the normal public policy concerns which exercise governments are put into a sort of political permafrost, because the only thing that counts is this great constitutional question which is going to put before the country. That was the case in the UK with Brexit. There was a sense in which all governments, I think, take their eye off the ball on the domestic agenda. So everything at that point was really set up for the 18th of September 2014. And perhaps the interesting thing was that the negotiations that paved the way for the Edinburgh Agreement, which underpinned how the referendum was going to be conducted, was really pretty cordial. There was no great fallout between the two governments because Westminster accepted that there had to be a referendum. And therefore, Alec, I suppose it's a question. Was Cameron simply bowing to the inevitable, or was Cameron quite happy, in a sense, to get on with this because he could entertain no circumstances at all in which the yes side would win, given that at that time, probably around about 2011, support for independence, according to opinion polls, was in the high 20s. So there was no basis upon which to suppose that granting a referendum or agreeing a referendum was attached to any sense of a political gamble.
Well, I think there are a couple of things to be said in response to that, and you're absolutely right. But a referendum was inevitable. I think it had to be agreed. It had to take place because, you did have this mandate from the Scottish government. There were lots of clever commentators in London who around that time were saying, oh dear, poor Alex Salmond. He's now got to deliver on the referendum. He can't seriously want one because it's obvious he's going to lose and lose badly, which was, I think, a profound misreading of both Alex Salmond and the independence movement and the mood of the country, frankly, because quite clearly, if you're a pro-independence party and you suddenly get a shot at a referendum, you take it. And so there was a lot of sort of fencing about, well, how many questions should there be? Should there be a multi-option referendum? Should there be a two-part referendum? Should there be a so-called Devo Max, however that's to be defined, option on it? And Cameron now sort of says, well, I was always very clear that I wanted it to be a simple, straightforward yes or no type question. And Salmond was very happy with that too, because if you'd had any kind of middle ground, then a third option, then seems quite possible that that's the one that would have commanded more support than any of its alternatives, because people would sort of gravitate towards a messy, muddled compromise. Whereas, so the yes/no question, at least it had the great benefit of clarity. And you're right. I think Cameron was quite happy to concede an awful lot during the negotiations. And you're right, they were pretty cordial. Michael Moore, the Secretary of State for Scotland, led for the UK government. Nicola Sturgeon led for the Scottish government. And Cameron essentially gave the nationalists most of what they wanted. They had control of the timetable, which was very important because they wanted a long campaign in which to build up support. They had control of the question, essentially, which was also important because it allowed yes to be the affirmative answer was for independence. And it is in some ways, I think, easier to campaign for a yes vote than a no vote because people like the idea of being for something rather than against something. And of course, they also had control of the franchise. Cameron was quite happy to concede that, yes, 16 and 17-year-olds should be allowed to vote. And he was also happy to concede, I think, quite importantly, and you can make a reasonable argument for it in practical terms, but he was also quite happy to concede that people born in Scotland, people who would consider themselves Scottish, but residing elsewhere in the United Kingdom, would not be allowed to vote in the independence referendum. They would be treated as though they were expatriates, even though they were living in the same state, the United Kingdom, as everybody who was actually voting in the referendum. And all four of those things, all those three of those things, the timing, the question, and the franchise, worked to the nationalists' advantage. And you could say that this was, if you're being generous to Cameron, you would say this was a generous offer. I think part of it did reflect the sense in Westminster that, look, come on, the breakup of the United Kingdom is unthinkable. The jocks will come to their senses. They'll realise that this is a nonsense, and there's no prospect whatsoever of the Yes campaign winning. which I think was a profound, and as it turned out, really definitely was a profound misreading of the situation. Because, yes, opinion polls suggested that support for independence was around 30%, but opinion polls go up and down. You only have to go back to a famous Scotsman poll from the early 1990s, which had support for independence at 50% then. Now, that was a one-off poll, but it clearly showed that the ceiling for support for independence was always much higher than merely 30%. And I assumed as soon as the referendum was agreed that there was absolutely no way the Yes campaign would fail to win at least 40%.
Yeah, I mean, history, I think, will be very tough on David Cameron in terms of his judgments. I mean, he managed to lose an entire continent in relation to the Brexit vote. And it's a somewhat laissez-faire attitude towards the negotiations on the Edinburgh Agreement. Likewise, I don't think will stand long-term scrutiny. I mean, I think that importantly, what was Salmond thinking at this time? Salmond was thinking that, and he knew that, first of all, he would not have terribly many, if any, newspapers on side. He knew that the broadcasters would do what the broadcasters do, and that when the referendum was called and you're into a regulated period, there are all sorts of rules and regulations about fairness and time and all of that. So he could perhaps worry less about broadcasting, although as the campaign actually emerged, he had considerable difficulties with the BBC in particular. He would have factored in, though, that in the media landscape, that it was more likely to be hostile than to be positive, and in some respects, in terms of newspapers, extremely hostile. He always worked on the view that if he could remain as positive as possible and as upbeat, to repeat your point, and it's absolutely correct, a number of voters will vote for change because they like the idea of change, they like the idea of something positive. And if people are living a life which is on the margins, where they don't seem to have much of a stake in society because they're marginalized in economic terms, the idea of change is an overwhelming one in actual fact. He also would have factored in that the campaign would have been dominated by a series of fundamental questions, particularly on the economy, which he would not have been able to answer persuasively, for the simple reason that you can't answer definitively questions about the whole nature of the setting up of a new state until you actually have the negotiations. I mean, how many people would change their vote in Brexit if they knew what emerged after the negotiations? So he would have known that it was a tall order because the polls say that he's way behind, a tall order because he knows that in terms of the newspaper environment, it's going to be overwhelmingly hostile. He will probably know that the government, the UK government, will call in favours from whoever in order to suggest that this is a bad idea. But he genuinely believed, this wasn't a line. This wasn't a line that he punted. He genuinely believed that if you could remain upbeat and positive, it could cut through. And to a certain extent, it did cut through, but it didn't cut through enough. He also actually genuinely believed. And he actually interviewed me about 6 weeks ago on the 10th anniversary of the referendum. There was a conference which was held in which we were sharing our reminiscences of the 18th of September 2014, and he sort of turned the tables on me. He was the interviewer, I was the interviewee. And I said that at no point, and this was my view as I was covering it, at no point did I think that Yes were ever going to win the referendum. Not even when we got that very excitable poll, which suggested that Yes were in the lead. At no point did I think that Yes were going to win, because there wasn't a stash of polls which were saying that there was an unmistakable trend on. The interesting thing about it, and he repeated this just a matter of weeks ago, he genuinely thought it was on.
Yeah, I mean, if you read his bookie book about the referendum, the dream shall never die, and so on, you get the impression that he never met anybody in an 18-month period, apart from Alistair Darling, I suppose, who was going to vote no. And I think, he had good grounds for being optimistic. As I say, I mean, I was always convinced that the baseline for level of support for yes would be 40% at the very minimum. And I remember being at a dinner in London at the headquarters of The Spectator with Andrew Neil and Fraser Nelson and various politicians and other people. And Andrew Neil, this was in January 2014, so sometime before the referendum, but we're well into the campaign then. And Andrew Neil sort of turned to me and said, let's put you on the spot. What's the result going to be? And I said, well, okay, look, obviously there's lots that can happen and so on. But right now, if you were to ask me, and you are asking me, I would say that Scotland will vote no, but it will be 53% to 47%. And there was a sort of prolonged silence around the table. And I remember Andrew Neil saying, gosh, that close. I mean, it was as though I felt as though, a whole load of people very plugged into politics, very knowledgeable, expert and brilliant in many ways and so on, simply hadn't really conceded the possibility that it could be, that it'd be close, let alone that yes could win. And yes had certain things in their advantage. And, you had a Conservative government that by that stage was not hugely popular in Scotland, led by David Cameron and George Osborne. You'd had a period of public spending austerity that allowed you to present a more upbeat or economic alternative post-independence, buttressed by the fact that in the preceding 3 or 4 years, you'd actually had very high oil receipts. So the JERS figures at that point came closer to demonstrating that an independent Scotland would start off from a fiscal position that was broadly in line with the UK's overall fiscal position. And that is to say that Scotland's position was not noticeably worse than the UK's. That's not a case you can make anymore. It is quite clear on that. The JERS figures that were gold standard back then, in the words of Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, they remain gold standard, I would suggest. So, he had certain things in his favour, and momentum, a positive story of change, and certain strong, compelling arguments. I mean, you do not have to be in favour of independence to recognise that the argument, Scotland's future in Scotland's hands, a sort of tartan version of take back control, as we saw in 2016 in the Brexit referendum, is a powerful, resonant message, and that the idea that as many of the decisions that affect Scotland should be taken in Scotland is a perfectly respectable and very plausible, quite attractive democratic argument, and it's something that's very easy for people to understand and intuitively tap into. One of the odd things about, I remember a couple of weeks ago we were talking about the BBC Firecrest Films documentary on the Salmond-Sturgeon relationship, and at one point in that, referring to the referendum campaign, Nicola Sturgeon said something that was quite interesting, I thought. She said that basically she was running the referendum campaign. For the most part, that Alec had a broad strategic overview, perhaps, but in general terms, day-to-day stuff, he wasn't all that actively engaged until the final stages of it. I have to say that was not my impression at the time, and it suggests to me that there is a certain amount of rewriting of history going on, because it was quite clear to me that the tone and temper of the Yes campaign, which we could talk a bit more about and so on in terms of the detail of some of the claims it made, was clearly directed by Alex Salmond.
Yes, I mean, I think it's fairly true to say that up until the point when we were in the regulated period of the referendum, quite a lot of the public presentation of the case was done by Nicola Sturgeon. STV in particular held a number of debates on the Constitution, where Nicola Sturgeon debated Michael Moore, she debated Alistair Carmichael, she debated Joanne Lamont, and it has to be said that in relation to the debates with Michael Moore and Alistair Carmichael, they were not a pretty watch, because
that was the Help Me Rona debate, wasn't it?
It was indeed. I mean, she certainly bested the two Lib Dem politicians. The one with Joanne Lamont was almost incoherent because it ended up with the two of them actually shouting at one another. Although the interesting thing was that in terms of actually making the case, Joanne Lamont made a far stronger case than either Michael Moore or Alistair Carmichael. So she'd been given the constitutional brief. She was doing a lot of the public presentation. But when the campaign started, Alex Salmond took over. But of course, right at the early stage on the 5th of August, he had that debate with Alistair Darling, which he made a mess of. He absolutely made a mess of and would concede that. And I presented that program. It was 2 hours long. I'd never seen Alex Salmond as nervous, ever. His body language was very tight. And when he was doing the cross-examination of Alistair Darling in that program, he tried to use a number of silly points about men in the moon and all this kind of stuff, and almost do the cross-examination in the style of a comedian. And what he was trying to do was to mock Alistair Darling, to mock some of the lines that were coming from the Better Together campaign. Now, that would be a tall order for a comedian to deliver and get lots of laughs in a theatre. It's a taller order for a politician. It completely and utterly backfired. It was a presentational disaster. And of course, the flip side of the coin was that Alistair Darling cut to the chase and all of the difficult questions that needed to be answered around the currency. And in a sense, I think the entire campaign was almost fought out in microcosm in that debate, where the real selling point that Alex Salmond had was the possibility of what the country may be. It was trying to get people to buy into a mood. It was trying to get people to buy into an emotion. It was trying to get people to lift their eyes and their hearts beyond all of these questions. But of course, the Better Together campaign and Alistair Darling was saying, but. There's no point in dreaming unless you actually have these points and you answer these points. And at the end of the day, enough people in Scotland looked at it from a point of view of quantifiable risk and said to themselves, this is not for us.
Yeah, and I think it is also worth pointing out that certainly in my view, the Yes campaign made an awful lot of claims that were just simply not true. And that, they get very annoyed, SNP people and Yes campaigners get very annoyed whenever you do a sort of read across between or a comparison between the Yes campaign and the Brexit campaign led by Dominic Cummings and Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson and so on 2 years later. But there are substantial similarities in rhetoric, not in terms of policy ambition and policy destination, but in terms of rhetoric and the way in which arguments are presented. Those comparisons are very apt in my view. So you had things like, Salmond sort of asserting, it's Scotland's pound. We can have a currency union with the rest of the United Kingdom, even if the rest of the United Kingdom doesn't want it. So he was, writing a check there that he could not cash in the same way as EU membership. And of course, independence within Europe had been crucial to the rise of the SNP, I think, because the Europe membership of the EU provided a kind of safety blanket. It suggested that, Scotland would not be too small and too on its own as an independent country. And so the Yes campaign says, well, of course, we would just inherit our current EU membership, even though we'd be a new state. There is absolutely no grounds for thinking that would be the case. The successor state would quite obviously, I think, as a matter of law and politics, have been the Rump UK. But in the midst of a referendum campaign, it fell to Alistair Darling in particular to be the sort of pointer out of uncomfortable truths, which was not something that many people were in the mood to hear, because when you're on this great journey of national awakening, of national discovery, this marvelous adventure into the possibilities of an infinite future, which was what the Yes campaign were essentially promising and so on, then it is, it suddenly becomes poor form to be sort of pouring cold water on all these sort of dreams, hopes and aspirations. And so in terms of the mood, it was absolutely clear, yes, that Salmond and the Yes campaign caught a certain mood in Scotland. But it was the mood of the people who were doing all the talking. There were a lot of people in Scotland who were quite quiet, who didn't say a lot, who didn't enjoy the referendum campaign because they found it ugly and divisive, and who didn't believe the Yes campaign's promises. And they were that sort of quiet Scotland that didn't put posters up in its windows, that didn't fly flags, that didn't go on marches, was the Scotland that ultimately prevailed. But because that Scotland was so quiet, you could understand perhaps why Salmond and for other people in the Yes campaign, the final result became such a shattering blow and a surprise to them, because they hadn't actually met that Scotland during the campaign.
I mean, I'm sure that they must have had private polling, which suggested that the Better Together campaign were ahead. I think that they were relying on this issue of momentum, that they seemed to have momentum. And there's no doubt that where they were at the beginning of the campaign and where they ended up, there was a certain degree of momentum with Yes. It just wasn't enough. And of course, when the first result came in Clackmannanshire, I think Alex Salmond then started drafting the speech which he made at Bute House later that morning, because it was clear that if Yes was going to triumph, the result in Clackmannanshire, according to all of the psephological briefings that I was given, should have been on an absolute knife edge. It was almost a sort of 50-50 authority, and of course it was carried by Yes. Carried by No. I sometimes wonder, and I never asked him this. I never ever asked him this. If it is time again, would he have stayed on? Because there was absolutely no reason why he should have resigned on the 19th of September, or signalled that he was going to resign on the 19th of September. Because once the immediate disappointment of losing the referendum was out the way, he credibly could have said 45% is some base upon which to make an assault on this question in the future. And there would have been a view that the war was lost, but there were several battles within that war, significant battles that were won. And there was nobody within the SNP who was agitating for Alex Salmond to stand down. And if he hadn't stood down, how things may well have been different. But I think by that point, his judgment would have been that he was battle weary. I think he was very, very tired. And I think that at that point, and all senior politicians have one eye on legacy. It tends to mean a lot to people who have been in power. He could have looked back and said, I've taken the party from being on the fringes of politics into government. I've taken it to within 10 percentage points of independence. My legacy as a senior figure, as the most important figure in the national movement in Scotland is cemented. That is quite a good legacy. This is quite a good time to get out. But of course, that legacy, which if we were writing the story of Salmond on the 19th of September, would have been a very, very generous legacy in historical terms. That legacy would go on to be tarnished by what happened when he departed the political stage.
Absolutely, and that brings us obviously on to the second part of this podcast. Where the first half is referendum, the second half is fall. Because you're quite right. Nobody on the 19th of September 2014 could have foreseen or anticipated, let alone predicted, what would happen in terms of Alex Salmond, what would happen in terms of his relationship with Nicola Sturgeon, with the SNP. And you're right, we get into a sort of darker, more complicated place very quickly. For what it's worth, on the question of him standing down, I am absolutely convinced that he did regret standing down so abruptly after the referendum, even though he was, I think, also in some ways correct. And I've been in this second spell as leader of the party. I've done a decade, 7 years as First Minister. That's a good shift. It's time to move on. And I think he may also have felt that on the national question, in 2014, the result, yes, it's a pretty good result for Yes. It's a result that keeps Yes on the field, if you like. But there is at that point absolutely zero prospect of envisaging really any grounds for reopening that question, for putting it to the people a second time. And so where would you go? And after the big drama on a sort of national, international scale of the referendum campaign, to go back to answering questions at Holyrood every Thursday about, a roundabout in Aberdeen, or some poor fellow in Ayrshire and so on who can't get his hospital appointment, would have, I think, seemed quite small beer for Alex Salmond. It would have been a hell of a come down. And so he quits. Obviously, he fights the general election in Westminster in 2015, wins the seat in Gordon. But he's not happy. It's quite clear, I think, that very rapidly Alex Salmond's ego is wounded, I think. I think he expected that Nicola Sturgeon, his longtime deputy and protege, would be calling him, asking for advice, or at least using Salmond as a sounding board. And it becomes very clear very quickly that isn't going to happen. Nicola is our own person with her own team, her own ideas, many of which are very different from Alex Salmond's, actually, because she's a much more orthodox left-wing figure than he is. And those calls never come. And Salmond is suddenly on his own. He has lost an empire and not yet found a role, you could say. And that hurts. And then things go from bad to very bad very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there were people close to Alex Salmond who were saying, do not go back to Westminster, because they understood the point that this is a man for whom politics is in his blood. When he gets out of his bed first thing in the morning, the brain is in overdrive thinking about what's going on in the world that day, and it continues to whir all day until he goes to bed that evening. And people knowing his temperament, his personality, his instinctive desire to lead would have known that he was going to be a backseat driver. When Margaret Thatcher left Downing Street, she didn't really leave Downing Street because she clearly tried to influence the premiership of John Major, and that was unwelcome. You cannot have a new leader who comes in who has any self-respect for their own abilities and their own desire to lead, who is going to allow themselves to effectively be driven by someone who did the job previously. They have to find their own way. They almost have to make their own mistakes. And of course, one of the problems that I think that Alex Salmond had specifically at Westminster is that in 2015, we have all of these new MPs who are elected. Now, many of them who have been elected are all completely new. Some of them were political activists one day and members of Parliament the next day. Many of them would not have known Alex Salmond. Many of them would not have campaigned with him for many years. Yeah, sure, there would have been people like Brendan O'Hara who had been around the party a long time who knew him. People like Ian Blackford who went back with Salmond a long way and fell out with him along the way. But the mainstream of the group that was elected in 2015, in a sense, didn't feel that they owed him. Many of them would not have known him. And a number of them said to me privately that they resented the way in which every time he spoke at the group, he simply expected people to fall into line behind whatever it was that he was punting. And, they almost said there was really two leaders. You would have even Angus Robertson, Ian Blackford, and then Salmond. And of course, up the road in Scotland, you're getting people who are perturbed that there is almost a sort of leadership in exile. And I think that was a function of his personality. And I'm not saying that insofar as he was rocking the boat behind the scenes or within the group, he was doing it without a purpose, because a lot of the time it would be, I think the government are making a mistake in this. Mm-hmm. I think they're making the wrong call. But probably there was a bit of it. There certainly was a bit of it where he felt put out, or almost that he felt that his previous contributions weren't being properly recognised, and being properly recognised, that people were not prepared to trust his judgment and go along with what he wanted.
Absolutely, and I think there is, no doubt that Angus Robertson, who was leader of the Westminster Group at that time, felt that Salmond was often undermining his leadership and was often unhappy with Salmond, and felt that Salmond was no kind of a team player, which is perhaps not a surprise, because after all, Salmond had spent most of the previous 20 years as captain of the team. So it's not a particularly happy period. And then in 2017, there's a great unionist backlash at the general election against the SNP. Pro-UK voters aligned themselves to vote for whichever unionist party is best placed to defeat the SNP incumbent. And in Gordon, that means you have a lot of people who previously voted Liberal Democrat in that constituency who swing behind Colin Clark, the Conservative candidate. And then I think it's around 3:30 in the morning, isn't it? It's for no voters in 2014. It is a real "were you up for Salmond" moment, and it is confirmed that Salmond has lost his seat, the first election that he's lost since 1987. Since before 1987 rather, when he first entered the House of Commons, and that is. The sort of cheers from pro-UK Scotland can be heard the length and breadth of the country at that moment. And suddenly Salmond is out of Parliament. He's out of politics. Again, what does he do next? There is a problem for the nationalist movement in certain respects, in as much as you have this big beast, this giant beast, the biggest beast of them all, and so on. And it's not clear how you're going to handle him, how you're going to use him, what his point is.
Yeah, and of course, his last line when he was defeated, "You haven't heard the last of my bonnets and me." Well, we hadn't heard the last of them, but in terms of what we were hearing, that then starts to be very problematic indeed, because it's at this point where his character, it's at this point where his judgments are really called into question. It's this point where there is the genesis of the fallout with Nicola Sturgeon. And of course, it was eventually to lead all the way to the High Court on a series of charges on an indictment, including 2 of attempted rape. But of course, there were 2 issues really in terms of allegations which were made against Alex Salmond. There was allegations which were made internally within the Scottish government about his conduct as First Minister, and how the government had to deal with them, process them. And then there was the second issue of a police investigation, which was eventually going to lead to a trial at the High Court. And although to a certain extent the 2 issues are separate, the 2 issues were separate, and it's important to stress that when it got to the High Court, Alex Salmond was cleared of all of the charges, and we have to keep repeating that point because sometimes it's lost in discussions which take place. But in a sense, the issue of his character, a light is shone in that with some of these issues. And even when it comes to the case in the High Court, his defence lawyer, his defence QC as he was at the time, Gordon Jackson, in his address to the jury admits that his client could have been a better man. Even although he was acquitted at all of the charges, there were bits of evidence that came out which were extremely uncomfortable. And when the initial story was run in the Daily Record newspaper, which in a sense started off all of these events, Alex Salmond called the broadcasters to the Champney Inn in Linlithgow, effectively to give his side of the story, although there was only so much he could say. at that particular time. But the line that he used in the interviews, both to Colin Mackay from STV and Brian Taylor for BBC Scotland, was that he, and I paraphrase here, he wasn't an angel, that he'd done things in his life that he wasn't proud of, but he hadn't harassed women, and he was not guilty of criminality. I have not harassed women, and I'm not guilty of criminality. And he used that line time and again and again and again. And it's one of those lines which, in a sense, block off certain charges, but it invites a whole series of questions. Well, did you behave in such a way that was inappropriate but wasn't criminal? And of course, some of the evidence which came out at the trial was very, very uncomfortable. And then we get the split, which in a sense is not political. We get the split within the SNP, people who stand by Alex Salmond. And Nicola Sturgeon, I think, is genuinely horrified. I think she's genuinely horrified at the extent of the charges on the indictment. And I think that she feels that she is in an impossible situation, that she has to, and although again we get back to the other issue, which is how the Scottish government handle things, she sees that her role is to be detached from all of this. And he probably thinks that she should be more supportive because he's the mentor, because he's been a friend for many years. And the relationship effectively simply falls apart. And in some respects, I think gets very bitter as views within the SNP on Alex Salmond at that point become extremely entrenched.
Absolutely. And, there's an awful lot going on and it's very complicated. You're right about to draw the distinction between the complaints made by a couple of civil servants and the way the Scottish government handled those ineptly, unlawfully, the procedure, the investigation tainted by apparent bias, not actual bias, but apparent bias, or at least allowing for the possibility of bias, as the judge found it. And then the criminal trial, where again, Salmond's defence, and to be fair to him, I would suggest that some of the charges on the indictment were relatively flimsy, and it wasn't clear to me certainly that even reading the indictment that these amounted to a huge degree. But some of them, one charge of attempted rape and one charge of sexual assault with intent to rape, were clearly extremely serious. But for the majority of the charges on the indictment, Salmond's defence was not so much that these events didn't happen, although that was the case with the charge on attempted rape, but that my behaviour, yes, I do not dispute many of the facts presented here by the prosecution and so on, but my defence is that these were not criminal acts. And so, and the jury agreed, and you're absolutely right to note that he was acquitted on all counts. At the same time, however, you have behaviour which in other lines of work would be considered really quite problematic, to use a modern phrase. And so, for instance, in the events leading up to the infamous sleepy cuddle, you have a man who at that age is nearly 60, plying a younger aide with alcohol, taking her up to his bedroom, and then we have the sleepy cuddle. In other lines of work, that would be considered appalling behaviour, and it may not be criminal, but there is, a sense that amongst some of Salmond's most devoted supporters these days, there's a sense that anything which isn't criminal is absolutely fine. And this extends beyond the charges of sexual inappropriateness or misconduct. It extends to things like him agreeing to host a TV chat show on Russia Today, the Kremlin's propaganda TV station. And Salmond's supporters say, well, he didn't have any choice, if only one of the mainstream broadcasters, the BBC, STV, Channel 4, Sky, or whoever, had done the decent thing and said, yeah, we'll host it, we'll broadcast it, then he wouldn't have been forced to take the Russians' money, which is a pathetically low bar when it comes to, standards of expected behavior. And that Russia Today thing, I think, was also a very difficult moment for other people in the SNP. There were a lot of people in the SNP who suddenly thought, what is he doing? Where is his judgment gone? those were fair questions, I think. And you have a politician whose bitterness becomes more and more apparent as the years go on. And you get these wilder and wilder and darker accusations of a sort of deep state conspiracy against Alex Salmond. And I think it's reasonable to say that none of those have yet been substantiated.
I think the Russia Today thing was poor judgment on his part. I don't think he should have done it. I think people who were close to him would concede that as well. I think the mainstream view within the SNP at the time was one actually of horror. They just simply could not understand why he was doing this. But of course, Alec was always his own man. And I'm not so sure that he could see the damage that he was doing to his own reputation. I mean, on all of these issues which led to the High Court case, we do not know if these will ever be satisfactorily resolved from Mr. Salmond's point of view, because, of course, he has always maintained that he was the victim of a criminal conspiracy. And in that, he has the support of people like Kenny McCaskill. He has the support of people like Fergus Ewing. I heard Fergus Ewing make an impassioned defence of Alex Salmond a few weeks ago, in which he effectively accused colleagues of conspiring against Mr. Salmond. Alec Neil and Jim Sillars are now on board with this general line. I do not know. I do not know whether he was the victim of a conspiracy or not. People close to him say that there is evidence there which hasn't been put into the public domain that proves a conspiracy. Those who are close to Nicola Sturgeon regard this essentially as a smokescreen and say that there is no conspiracy. With Mr. Salmond's death, will the existing legal case, will that continue, or will that simply die with him? I don't know, but it may well be that the last word, in a sense, on some of the allegations that Alex Salmond has made will see the light of day. It is, I suppose, still possible. But on the trial itself, my own view was, and I remember I wrote a piece on it. Remember, the job of the Crown Office is to establish whether or not that a crime has taken place, whether or not there is corroborative evidence of a crime taking place, and thirdly, and this is a critical test as well, whether or not it is in the public interest to prosecute a certain charge. Now, it struck me that quite a lot of the stuff that was on the indictment did not pass the third test of being in the public interest to prosecute. Are we going to prosecute every time somebody brushes against someone, or somebody puts a hand on a shoulder, or somebody squeezes a knee? This kind of stuff, which could be described as low-grade nuisance behaviour, which is not criminal, the view which is taken is that it is not in the public interest to prosecute that kind of stuff, otherwise the courts will be completely clogged with all of it. But if there was corroborative evidence of serious criminality, then the Crown Office have a public duty to prosecute. My view, and it's one that's actually shared by, I think, a number of people in the legal profession, and I used to run this past lots of them that I know, is that this probably was a case that should have been tried in the Sheriff Court, and that it was, if I can put it like this, overly prosecuted. It may well actually explain why the current investigation into SNP finances is taking quite so long. Having had one politician stand in the dock of a criminal court, you wouldn't want another politician or the relative of a politician to stand trial and for the thing not to result in a guilty verdict. But I mean, there is no doubt that all of this is extremely damaging from his point of view. And in a sense, I think his sense of being very, very bitter towards the end is because he genuinely believes he was the subject of a conspiracy. And on that, as I say, I have no evidence. But the final word on whether or not there was will depend on future legal action. And if those legal actions go forward, there might be another line to write in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. I would disagree with you on the notion that this could have been tried in the sheriff court and that it was overly prosecuted. I think if you have a former First Minister facing charges of attempted rape, that's a matter for the High Court. Quite clearly, it seems to be. Now, again, of course, he was acquitted on that charge. But we are not yet at the point of resolving all of these issues in terms of the Salmond-Sturgeon affair. That this is something that is going to rumble on for quite a long time. It's quite possible there will never actually be a clear and satisfactory resolution to it all. I suppose the final act in Alex Salmond's political career is when he sets up the Alba Party as a splinter group, essentially, in some ways, an alternative to the SNP, a party I once suggested for all the people you've muted on Twitter, which was perhaps a little unkind, but in my case certainly true. A party for people who think the SNP has given up on Alex Salmond, not on Alex Salmond, indeed on Alex Salmond, but also on independence. And it's very much Alex Salmond's party. Do you think, Bernard, that the Alba Party, which I thought, again, like doing Russia Today, was an act of self-diminishment from Salmond, a rather pitiful and sad spectacle akin to, an aging heavyweight boxer who is the last person to understand he no longer has the punching power he once did. Do you think, do you agree with that? Do you think the Alba Party has any viable long-term future without Alex Salmond?
I think the only thing that we can say is that insofar as that it has dipped its toes into the electoral waters, it's been a lamentable failure. And indeed, at the most recent election, here we have a party which is led by a former First Minister, which at that point has been around for at least a couple of years, is absolutely trounced at the polls by Reform UK. So I think that we can conclude, as things stand, Alba is irrelevant to the electoral arithmetic. Now, the only sense I would qualify the judgment simply by saying this, because the SNP are, I think, in such a mess as to where they are going with the independence question, and I think John Swinney's view is that they're not going anywhere with it. They're going to fight the next election on bread and butter issues and relegate the constitutional question because their view is that the country does not have the stomach for yet another constitutional debate. Now, within the independence section of the electorate, I think there is some impatience with that point of view. If I can put it this way, Alba have been irrelevant, completely irrelevant up until now. There may well be a gap in the market in 2026, because we've discussed before, I think the result is going to be very, very messy. There may well be a gap in the market for an insurgent pro-independence party, specifically because the SNP are not going to talk big on independence in 2026. But for that gap in the market to be properly exploited, it was going to take probably someone with the political nous of Alex Salmond to exploit it. I don't think Alba will fold. I don't think they will, say, well, that's it. The great man is no more. It's time that we all sort of pack up and go home. I'm sure that they will fight the next election in 2026. I think the terrain will be slightly more sympathetic. Do I think that they will do terribly much? My instinct is no. I don't. But was it a vanity project? You can say that it was a vanity project. I think that probably does a slight disservice to the 7,000 people who are members of that
Only
party.
A very slight one, though. Come on, Bernard.
But no. These are people who are, many of them who have been in the independence movement a long, long, long time, and who happened to share Alex Salmond's analysis of where the SNP had gone wrong. there was probably never any chance, never, ever, ever any chance that Alex Salmond was going to say to himself after he lost the seat in Gordon, do you know what? I've had a good run at this. I've had a long political career. I've had, by most yardsticks, a relatively successful one, but perhaps in your Powell's words, all political careers left in failure. I'm going to do a bit of traveling. I'm going to do a bit of reading. I'm going to take life easy. Anyone who's ever been around this man at all knew that there was absolutely zero chance of that happening.
Absolutely. And that brings us, I suppose, to the final question, which is, what is Alex Salmond's legacy? And here I think it's important to distinguish between where he stood at the very end of his life, where he was actually probably the most unpopular politician in Scotland, because most people who voted no in 2014 had no great reason to love or like Alex Salmond, even if they had once appreciated his political skills. And of course, many people who are SNP voters had also reason to dislike and distrust Alex Salmond by the end. So it's important to distinguish, I think, between that rather pitiful situation, this great titan of Scottish politics, laid low by a combination of historic circumstance and his own miscalculations and choices and decisions, and the broader question of his legacy, which is substantial. Immensely substantial, much more significant political figure in Scottish history than anybody else in the last 50 years, I would suggest. Because Salmond, more than any other individual, and although there are always lots of historical processes at play, lots of things which coalesce and combine to create a given political moment, nevertheless, more than any other individual, Alex Salmond was the person most responsible for normalizing the idea of independence, for making something which was perhaps once unthinkable, now thinkable. And that is a legacy which endures. Because, we know this from polling, we know this from conversations with people. We know that although there isn't going to be an independence referendum anytime soon, in the medium to long term, it is very difficult to say that Scotland's constitutional question has been definitively settled. And the fact it remains open, and the fact that the Yes campaign got so close to victory, a victory that you can argue they should have won, but they got so close to victory, is Alex Salmond's legacy, because that national question is still the fulcrum around which the rest of Scottish politics turns.
When I sort of think of his life and career, I take myself back to sitting in the living room of his mother and father in Linlithgow in 2001 when I was making that documentary. And what struck me about them was that they were both lovely people and very humble people. And he came from a very ordinary working class Scottish background. And I remember Jim Siller saying that when Jim first went to the House of Commons in 1970, after he won the South Ayrshire by-election, lots of working class Labour MPs were scared to speak when they were faced with the massed ranks of all these old Etonians that faced them. Alex Salmond came from a very, very modest background, a world away from what you would find in the upper echelons of Westminster. The astonishing thing is that he'd no self-doubt. He lacked no self-doubt when he went to Westminster. He was brimming with self-confidence and a sense of being intellectually assured. And I think that was, I admired him for that, I have to say. I think that these were great skills. I think these skills and his mind were deployed to drag a party from a protest movement to make it mainstream, to make it fashionable. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of your conclusion, to make the idea of independence something which is not seen as silly or loopy, but something which is worthy of serious debate and of entertaining seriously. In historical terms, it's a huge, huge legacy. But because of the way in which the latter years of his life went. And because of the shining a light or questions being asked about his personality, the political legacy, which is a substantial one, in some respects the shine has been taken off, because not anything to do with his politics, but because of allegations which are made about his personal conduct and his personal behaviour. But as I said, the last word on that may well be written another day if there are more court proceedings that emanate from some of the events which we have talked about on this podcast. But we hope that in sharing our views and our analysis on this very significant and substantial life, some people may well have learned something. Some people will approve of some of the comments. Others will absolutely detest them. Absolutely detest them and disagree with them. But they're based upon, in my case, someone that I knew for 35 years, and saw actually quite a bit of in recent weeks before he died. He was a significant figure, and as many people who are close to him will say, it will be a long time, perhaps, before we see a Salmond, someone of his quality, bestride the political stage in Scotland.
Absolutely, and I don't think that Alex Salmond would be particularly perturbed by the idea that his life, his legacy, his achievements, his weaknesses, his failures were matters of considerable and significant furious disputation, because that was something that he accepted was the price of being in the arena, was the price of politics, the nature of politics, which is of disagreement and differing perspectives clashing. But of his significance and consequence, there is no doubt. And I think I agree with you, Bernard, that it is unlikely we will see a figure of comparable stature at any point in the short, medium, or even possibly long-term future. And so that it seems like the appropriate point at which to end these reflections on the life and times of Alex Salmond. It's been great chatting with you as always, Bernard. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.